Hello and welcome to the 9th instance of the Technical Insight Series webinars from Akamai. These webinars are intended for a technical audience, folks who manage or will manage Akamai services for their organization. We greatly appreciate your attendance today and hope you find the session useful. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please turn up the volume of your PC, tablet, or headphones until you can hear us clearly. All attendees will be muted for the entire duration of the webinar. If you have any trouble hearing or viewing the presentation, please use the Q&A window to let us know. Also, please type any questions into the Q&A section. We will be answering your questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's session. There is a survey towards the end of this webinar, and we request you to fill it out. This helps us tweak our future sessions. It lets us know what we did good and where we can do better. Here is a brief agenda for today. We'll be doing the introductions in just a moment, followed by the main presentation, and then we will dive into Q&A towards the last 10 to 15 minutes. Today, our focus is on security. Our presenter is Roger Barranca, who heads our Global Security Operations Center. Roger is responsible for all our SOCs across the globe, and he will be talking about how to defend against the Mirai Botnet and the next wave of mega attacks. So without further ado, here is Roger Barranca.
Thank you for that introduction, Dilip. Welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to review one of the more serious cyber threats out there in the world today. As you peruse this overview, please know that, in my opinion, the section that talks to what you can do will be the most important. I really want to focus as we go through this information on how you can take action. So if you have questions, I'd be very happy to field them towards the end, as Dilip mentioned, and catch those. Otherwise, I believe that this session will be recorded and another facility will be put in place to field questions. So as we move forward, I wanted to just talk generically about attacks and share a little bit of information about the destination. A lot of the attack reports that you read talk about source of attacks and types of attacks, but they rarely talk about or focus heavily on destination. So I wanted to quickly throw this pie chart up. Now, these are attacks from the routed perspective, not WAF, and it shows that of late, most attacks have been aimed at systems in the Americas, with good representation certainly being aimed at EMEA and to a smaller degree to APJ. And that ties into size of infrastructure, risk of customer, and several factors. But I thought everyone may find it interesting to know the global breakdown of attacks in general. Now, when we talk about attack trends, I can tell you that attacks have increased by approximately 75% when you compare 2016 over 2015. Now, over the last couple of months, there's been a slight drop-off, but as you can see by looking at this chart, it's fairly jagged, comes and goes. A lot of attacks are very driven by the political environment, if there are nation-state actors, if it's people pushing for ransomware, if it's criminally driven. There's a lot of different actors, and there's a very heavy ebb and flow to the attacks, the type of attacks, and the size of the attacks. Now, when we talk about size of attack, if you were to get a presentation like this a few years ago, you would see that size of attack would be the #1 topic, and we'll go over some of that. At least for our environment, that's much less of an issue because of the size of our platform. The things that are challenging are the zero-day attacks, things that are brand new. It takes time to decipher what is new about this attack, and then what even takes a little bit longer is saying, what does the customer expect from a normal traffic flow perspective? You have to ask a lot of questions, and that's one of the first things that you can do. And, when we say know your environment, I'm sure most people say, yes, I know my environment intensely well. But it's surprising while under duress when questions like what are the IPs of your DNS servers, things like that are asked, that it takes a fair amount of time to get an answer. And that time to respond with information about your infrastructure to whomever you're working with to defend you can be a killer, obviously. So when we talk about specific type of attack vectors, there are things in this list that may not surprise everyone, but you would be surprised to know how many people don't defend proactively against services that they do not need to see. So for example, UDP fragment is the #1 type of attack that's being thrown at customers today. UDP fragment is a little more difficult to handle, but overall something that can be knocked down pretty quick because it's independent of the service that it's being aimed at. But tied in with that, if you look a little further to the right, you'll see UDP flood. There are a lot of things that you can do to defend yourself against these types of attacks that are very simple. So for example, UDP, obviously you need that type of service for your DNS infrastructure, but you generally don't need that type of service for mail services, for your web services, for a lot of your other applications. There's no reason that I can think of why someone wouldn't be highly aware of what components in your infrastructure require UDP. And if they don't require UDP, just put a generic block, all UDP from reaching the rest of your infrastructure. You can look at some of these services like Chargen, NTP. Those are services that are rarely used. I would bet that Chargen is over 20 years old. I would be really surprised if more than a fraction of 1% of people are still using that protocol. Yet it is a highly prominent form of attack. Again, for most customers, that means that you should just block Chargen up front and not allow it. DNS flood, that's kind of the opposite. It ties in with UDP flood. That's more of an attempt to overwhelm your infrastructure, same as UDP. So the fact that it's DNS flood, the fact that it's UDP fragment, yes, you can defend yourself against the baseline attacks that go against you, but size of attack is the killer. Obviously a lot of these attacks are quite huge. I'll show a graphic later that shows one of the largest attacks last year was in the 620 gig range. Not too many enterprises have more than a gig of capacity, and you can see where a 620 gig cannon being aimed at any individual is going to be quite damaging. And that's why you use someone upstream from you in a cloud service possibly to be able to knock down that volumetric attack. The volumetric attack, as I stated earlier, is actually easier to handle because it's more of a sledgehammer approach. It's easier to put mitigation in place to defend against that. But the message here is, as you look at this list, there are an awful lot of heavily used protocols that are not in use by organizations or minimally used by organizations. So I would suggest taking the opportunity to go through and implement those blocks as soon as possible proactively. Now, when we talk about your defensive posture, what you're blocking, what's important that you receive, obviously HTTP, HTTPS for your web services, you need to share that information with your security services provider so that they can build for you a proactive defensive posture. So for example, if I have a customer and I have that defensive posture in place that says, we never see Chargen, just go ahead and block that, the customer will never even feel so much as a momentary blip when a huge attack is sent their way because I'm going to be able to proactively block that for them. What happens a lot of times is the customer may not be aware of that piece of information about whether they do or don't have Chargen type services in their infrastructure. And the attack will come in. It will initially reach the customer. The SOC will get engaged. The SOC will call you as the customer, and the SOC will say, we're seeing charge-in traffic. May we block that for you? We have to ask that question. If the affirmative is given, then we block it and stop it. The bad news is that that traffic has already flowed to you at that point, right? So at that point, you may have already felt some pain from a firewall perspective, from a load balancer perspective. It takes time, as you know, to recover. Sometimes you may have to reboot that infrastructure, and that can take easily 20 minutes to be turned around. And to avoid that, go ahead and build that defensive posture on your side. Share that defensive posture with your security vendor so that, as best possible, that defensive posture can be pushed up into the cloud. I'll quickly mention, I see less of it today, but a couple years ago it was more of an issue, and that's on the internal process side. At one point, it took some customers a long time to get permission to implement mitigation. I think there have been so many attacks out there that that's less of an issue today, and they've worked it out where the business has empowered the security professional in their group to be able to pull the trigger, for lack of a better description, to implement mitigation, enact, for example, the Security Operations Center, my team here, to go ahead and service them. There were times in the past, and it still happens on occasion, so which is why I'm warning you about it, where, oh, I have to wait, I have to get permission internally, I have to escalate this. Yes, I know it's 3 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday or a different time zone, but it takes a fair amount of time to get that permission. In the meantime, your services are down and suffering greatly along the way. So I wanted to swing back to Mirai versus what we just completed, which is more generic in nature. And as you know, there are three main components from a defensive perspective that if any one of them are hurt, it takes out generally the entire customer infrastructure, and that's the router, the firewall, the front-end data center routed component, your DNS infrastructure, and then your HTTP web application services. Any one of those is a problem, so you have to obviously focus very specifically and uniquely on each of these areas to defend yourself, right? So unlike many attacks out there, Mirai is very specific. It's easily morphed and updated. The bad part here is that the attackers are super vigilant. We've been defending customers against nation state, and it wasn't unusual to say, oh, I know what time it is, it's quitting time for them, and there's a lull in traffic for 8 hours or so, and then it comes back again, and probably on a Sunday it's going to be slower or whatever it happens to be, wherever those resources are available. And it's not as contiguous. The attackers that are using Mirai are extremely good, and there are no, that we've seen, simple front-end dashboards available yet. So everyone knows they've been talking about this, script kiddies for years and years and years. That's old hat, and it's where someone that doesn't know anything about IT can throw a few Bitcoin at a dashboard and say attack www. and whatever victim you want to put in there and let it go, and it does some very basic things. Mirai doesn't have that simple front end. So it's not widely available yet to the generic lower end attacker. I'll describe it in that way. But the people that are using it, as I said before, are really good. They know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly how to hurt the customer. What we're seeing is, a lot of DDoS attacks are generic when it goes out and, it's a UDP flood, whatever it happens to be. Most of the Mirai attacks are very specific, so people are taking their time to scan the victim, learn about their infrastructure, and know exactly what the best attack is. And if that attack, once it gets knocked down, how do I morph it? Do I morph from a layer 3, layer 4 attack to a layer 7 attack? Do I go to a DNS attack at layer 7 also? How do I want to do this to hurt the customer, and how am I spreading that attack out? Is really, unfortunately, quite impressive. most of the attacks that we're seeing that are Mirai-based, that are larger and more professional, are ransom-based. So the customers are receiving letters, send me Bitcoin or else, and it takes off from there. Now, I would say that probably 60 to 70% of the time, at least in my experience, when a customer receives that kind of ransomware note, the attack actually does happen. Yes, a fair amount of time it's probably someone trying to trick them into giving them some Bitcoin, but the majority of the time they really mean it, and they really do go after the customer in a hard way. So Mirai, the name, it's a Japanese word for the future. I think it's a really good name. Unfortunately, it's very easy to change and grow, and I think it is not going away. The reason that it's not going away is, as you know from reading other articles, I'm sure, that it leverages IoT devices, so Internet of Things devices. So that's IP cameras, that's the wireless router that's in your house. In some cases, it's refrigerators. It's something that we've seen for a long time, but until Mirai came along, it wasn't pulled together in such a powerful way. The reason this is so risky is if there's a vulnerability found, how to patch that vulnerability is shared with the community out there. They perform their patches slowly, unfortunately, usually, but they eventually do get patched up and that vulnerability goes away. The likelihood of someone who owns a gas station that has a security camera outside taking the time to hook up to it and perform a patch exercise is very close to zero. Right? They don't have the same diligence or risk that a risk would be in place within a normal infrastructure, right? So that's the problem, that this threat is not going to go away anytime soon from its existence perspective. There are other things that can be done to slow it down, and we're actually starting to see at times a little bit of a slowdown, and we believe that's probably because the bot is in contestment. So when it was originally released out into the wild, it had been out for a while, but when it was released for everyone to play around with, a lot of people jumped on it and said, well, let me see who I can attack. Well, that diluted its capabilities, right? But the size of this bot is absolutely massive. As I stated before, the professionals that are leveraging it know how to make it extremely powerful, which is what we're still seeing. Some of those common vectors I've also listed down there. I'm just calling them out because most tools are very specific. Oh, this tool only does UDP, for example, but Mirai can be morphed to do all of these types of attacks. So how does Mirai infect hosts? And shortly after this screen, I have a couple more graphical representations that I think will tell the story well and how it works. But it basically looks at a wide range of IP addresses and it scans. And what's unique is its ability to be a scanner to look for more IoT devices that can be compromised, as well as the actual attacker. And that's all controlled from the C2, the command and control box, that tells it how to run those systems. It doesn't do anything magical at this point, right? It's just scanning out there, looking for an IoT device, and using very common passwords and login combinations. Yeah, big surprise, root password, admin, things that we all know are a huge no-no in the security world, but the manufacturers are trying to make it easy for the non-technical to implement their device, and the user, if they're not technical, they don't understand, what's the big deal? I'll just leave it as admin. Who's going to want to hack my camera? I don't care if they hack my camera and look at the inside of my gas station or whatever it happens to be, right? But that is not a good citizen thing to do from a internet good user perspective. Now, what's really cool about this tool is that once a device is compromised, it actually goes and shuts down secondary services. So it'll shut down Telnet, HTTP, SSH. It's attempting to keep that IoT device onto itself. It's trying to say, no, I don't want anybody else to have access to this device from which the attack can go out. So just to share some numbers about the number of bots that are out there, it's always changing. It's always growing. There are databases out there that are holding approximately 13.5 million endpoints. Now, when you consolidate that, if you remove redundancy and duplication in that list, it comes down to about 3.5 million endpoints at any one point in time that are available for attack. Each one of these endpoints will have different capacity from a bandwidth capability perspective. But when you put them all together, and as we know, if there's fiber going to every home, they're trying to get that going everywhere, right? So that's a significant amount of bandwidth that can come out from just one device, and it's the multiple of devices that can be so damaging. So they also try to lock itself out. It's familiar with what areas it's trying to not poke the bear. It's trying to avoid certain areas. So it doesn't scan Department of Defense IP space. Pretty smart, well thought out on how they work through building this particular bot. So what we do here is we have a very strong CERT research team at Akamai, and they will download these bots and reverse engineer them. The purpose of doing that is to say, what is the capability of this bot? How can we prepare ourselves for the future of what this bot can do? And this is just a quick little snapshot from a TLP Green, which is a document we'll talk to later, a piece of information that's been shared out globally with the community at large. And it points out what its capabilities are basically from a UDP flood or an ACK flood or a SYN flood or a GRE protocol flood, which was very prominent for a while. We're starting to see that taper off, and it's shifting more towards DNS and layer 7 right now. Some GET flood in there also. So I wanted to talk a little bit about visually representing how the flow of data is when the attack starts. And there are three main components out there listed on the left-hand side. So the command and control, the C2. There's a report server that holds the information on where these bots are available. And then the infection server, which is the one that goes out and compromises these boxes. Or these IoT devices. On the right-hand side, it could be anything. No kidding, it could be your light bulb in your house that's controlled from your phone. It could, any device that's IoT that's out there. If you notice on the lower left-hand portion of the globe, we'll start with that as being the first bad actor in this scenario. So what will happen is you'll see in the upper left the command and control. Following that lower green line will first go to that IoT device. That IoT device will subsequently scan to the right within the globe looking for more IoT devices. As it finds more open IoT devices, it takes that information and sends it back to the report server, right? So the IoT device itself normally is not going to be the one to continue to push the infection and pull in more IoT devices. He'll just simply report back to that report server where more potential IoT devices are. Again, while it's scanning, it's trying common passwords along the way and usernames. It subsequently pushes that information to the infection server. The infection server on its own now reads the information that was handed to it from the IoT device into the report box and now goes and places that infection onto these additional openly available IoT devices. That information gets pushed back, the top green line, back to the command and control, the C2 box. When it does that, it says, I'm available, and it maintains a heartbeat. So it knows continuously whether that devices available to them for attack. That's really important so that it's not wasting its time, basically, right? Now, because a lot of these devices sit behind DHCP, a lot of times those IPs will change. That's why it has to scan. It's almost like a living organism needing to eat continuously. It's scanning continuously, looking for more and more devices out there. And a lot of times it's the same device, just that the IP has changed. The reason those IPs change a lot is if the person that owns that IoT device, that camera, reboots it or reboots their device that's connecting to the internet, the wireless device or the router, whatever it may be, DHCP will frequently give it a new IP at that point, or the ISP will give it a new IP. So it changes, it loses connectivity with that, the heartbeat drops, they know to start scanning again to pick up more of these devices. So almost like a living organism, very cyclical in how that information flows around, and extremely powerful with what you can do with it. Again, you can attack at any level. Now, if we talk very specifically, just one example using a DNS attack, and I'll get into why it's a challenge to handle, is let's assume the globe on the right has that 3.5 million endpoints that can be used for attack, right? So the attacker goes into the command and control box, gives the command on what it wants to attack. Those commands, again, are very specific. www.xyz.com, and it puts in very specific commands that are unique to that particular victim. Now, all of those bots actually, in this scenario, don't attack the victim directly. Most attacks, you'll see where those bots are actually going direct to the victim. What's very different here is they're making tons of query requests, DNS query requests, of valid ISP DNS servers. Now, why is that a challenge? The problem is you can't block by IP to stop this type of attack without DOSing yourself. So normally, one of the first things that someone will try, certainly an ISP will try, when mitigating this is, oh, this is a bad actor, I see bad traffic, let me just block that IP and walk away and not pay attention to them anymore. You can't do that in this scenario. In this scenario, because the bad actors are talking to all of the valid ISP DNS servers, you can't block that DNS server. If you were to ignorantly go in and say, well, I'm going to block all of these actors that I think are bad, you just DOSed yourself, because you've now prevented yourself from receiving DNS traffic. So the mission was accomplished, whether the bot did it or you did it to yourself, and that's not uncommon. So what happens is once that specific command is issued, then all of those DNS servers are now going to the victim in the lower right and absolutely overwhelming them. Now, when you look at the traffic, it's constructed in a totally valid way. So there's no way to say, oh, I can identify this as a malicious chunk of information. I'm just going to block that specific one. That's very, very difficult. There is some repetition in there. There are some signatures that can be put out there to stop that, but that for the average customer or victim in this situation, it's very costly from a CPU memory utilization perspective to be able to knock those kinds of attacks down. And the attacker always has the ability to morph it ever so slightly, and bang, it's going to go right past the signature defensive mechanism that's in place at the time. So what can be done with this portion of it is there are things like smart connection rate limiting techniques that can be put in place. That's very effective. So it's a multi-layered approach. Very difficult to defend, again, because the requests, the queries that are being made are totally valid from an RFC perspective, making it very difficult to parse out what's an intended query versus an unintended query. So when we look at the types of attacks that occurred, they were pretty impressive. Like I said before, one of the attacks was 620 gigs. A couple days later, it was mid 500 gig in range. And the attacker is trying different things. They'll start with size of the attack, and then they'll get very specific with a more granular layer 7 type of attack. So when you look at the graphing portal, you can see it's pretty easy to pick out that huge spike that goes in there. But again, the size of the attack isn't always the problem, and that's pretty easy. It's the packets per second that's damaging most frequently to the victim, right? Because it takes down, as I mentioned before, the firewall or that front-end router system. And even if mitigation is put in place secondarily or after the fact, it still leaves the customer in a very compromised position. Now they have to reboot their infrastructure. And yes, a lot of this is used as a distraction to create fraud on the back end side, right? So let's try to pull all of the security resources away from focusing on the fraud component. So it's a broad spectrum attack here frequently. Now, it's not only that one big spike. The attacker, like I said before, is extremely vigilant. So this is a quick example graphically that shows how the attacker was trying to keep it going. Very large spike, small spike, very large spike, small spike, just going back and forth. They're trying everything that they can to try to create pain. This particular attack was rather different. So we just finished going through a DNS attack. We also talked about the volumetric attack. And those are all typically aimed at a small number of entities on the victim's infrastructure or their side. And those are, can be handled because you know the segment on the victim's side that's being attacked. Something brand new that Mirai does extremely well, which is a very different tactic, is it spreads the attack out. So using simple math, instead of saying, I'm going to send 100 meg to their web server, I'm going to send 100 attacks at 1 meg each to 100 different IPs in the customer infrastructure. Well, that's a significant problem for most customers' firewalls, because firewalls are trained to have a certain amount of memory. That's how they do their job, is they put things into memory so that it can say, hey, is this a valid connection? Can I challenge this connection? Is it a SYN flood? Is it a spoofed IP? All these questions that the firewall is trying to answer from a security perspective. The problem is it's very good at doing that for a relatively small number of IPs. And that's normally okay because customers may not have hundreds of or thousands of web servers, for example, right? But this attack doesn't care. The firewall doesn't care either. He says, this is malicious, this is an attack, this is something anomalous, I need to track it. So the attacker is trying to say, if I can't knock you over with a very concerted attack to a few IPs, maybe I can knock you over by spreading you too thin and forcing you to look at multiple attacks and to try to decide how to handle it. That kind of attack was 0 day about 2 months ago. So a pretty new attack. We haven't seen a lot of it, but I really want to caution you heavily against that kind of attack. It ties back to where this presentation started about know your infrastructure, know what you expect. If you have a ton of IP space that doesn't have infrastructure behind it, please go ahead and put a block in place ahead of your firewall so it doesn't even have to be concerned with traffic that's flowing to it. So, when Mirai evolves, it's really sophisticated. And when you're looking at all of the different angles and all of the different avenues that it can attack you from, that's the importance of working with, my team, building your defensive structure in advance so that we can team with you on protecting you. So when we put together the Mirai Threat Advisory, it's currently tagged as a threat level of medium. That might surprise some people. You would think, oh, this is a big risk. It's not high. Well, when a threat level is high, that means it's typically meaning that it's newer and that the risk is extremely high because it's unknown in the environment. We know a lot more about Mirai now. There's a lot of write-ups about Mirai. So it was moved down to a medium because the assumption is made that customers have taken the appropriate actions to protect themselves. But I guarantee you that is, clearly not the case most of the time. And it's a big task. I know, but we are absolutely here for you. If you're working with us already, we can get together and build that defensive structure with you. So one thing that's federal law enforcement is definitely monitoring this in the background. During Operation Ababil a few years ago, the federal came in and did a lot to try to knock down the attack. They're trying to do a lot of this right now by going after the command and control centers and try to knock down the capabilities, but the problem is this life form of Mirai is extremely resilient, as I described before, and the likelihood of being able to chase down all the cameras in the world is really close to zero. So very good efforts being made, some progress definitely being made, but this threat's going to be around for a long time, and the more we understand about it, the better, obviously. So what can you do? Phase one is you need to identify what is your critical infrastructure, right? So, for example, if you have, again, simple math, 100 devices that are internet reachable, I know that's a small number, but for argument's sake, and maybe 5 of those devices are your web services, and you're in a retail environment where you're transaction-based trying to sell a product, for example, I would assume that it's more important to your business to keep that front end up and running at the expense possibly of some back-end services and those other 95 servers that are on the internet accessible. What you need to do is phase one is identify what are those absolute critical infrastructure, and then create a new profile that says when I'm getting attacked, and this is for any attack, not just for Mirai, if I'm getting attacked and we are unable to get a hold of it for whatever reason, what is my defensive posture? What is my bastion environment to go to? Work with my SOC, work with your security team, obviously, and build out what are the permits and denies that should be put into your environment to only allow internet access to those absolutely critical environment. That includes geo-blocking. Geo-blocking is a huge help. If you happen to be an entity that is mainly EMEA-based or mainly Americas-based, we can go ahead and work with you to say, you know what, let's block all of this traffic coming to you from regions that are not the majority of where your customers are located. That is it's aggressive, it's a sledgehammer approach. To be honest with you, I don't like it because that means it's cutting down your good traffic that you intend to receive from those regions. This is obviously not an acceptable stance to have for someone with a balanced global ingress from the internet. But most customers are very centric to their region, and because of that, have the advantage of being able to request some geo-blocking, at least until that zero-day attack is understood and worked out in a collaborative way to say what's the defensive measure. The second phase of it is pick, if you're in that 100 machine environment, let's bring that up and add another 25 or 30% to those machines that are now web accessible. Then you create a third phase, right? And that third phase is to bring the entire infrastructure back on, which proper mitigation is put in place, and then allow the whole globe to reach you at the appropriate rate. But it all comes down to that statement at the bottom of know your environment. And I know during peacetime it's easy to know your environment, but knowing your environment when everyone is on fire to try to correct an issue, that's difficult. That's not easy, right? So, what can Akamai do? Phase 1, we'll build that proactive defensive posture with you. We will work on the runbook. Uber critical is that runbook. We have to know who we should talk to on your side, what your expectations are on alert handling, what your expectations are on mitigation. Let's work all of that out way in advance. We can test that out with you. We can set up, if you have some maintenance windows, we can test it with you and put everything in place to get you as proactively defended as possible. Then, over time, phase 2, we'll loosen those controls, check it again, and finally on phase 3, even though the attack is ongoing, we'll remove all of those tight restrictions like the geo-blocking and the heavy ACLing of traffic, and be able to be laser focused on what specifically we need to knock down from a malicious traffic perspective, right? So some things that you can do on the Akamai site, there are threat advisories. There's a very nice write-up actually on Mirai that's fairly technical that you can go in and get some good information out of there. There are also cert services, and on a quarterly basis there is a State of the Internet report that you can download that has a tremendous amount of information about what we have seen over the last 3 months approximately from an attack perspective, and your job would be then to take that, ingest it, and see how it applies to your environment. But a lot of great information is proactively shared out. Now, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure that there are some questions. It's going to be my pleasure to go over them, but I'd like to transfer back to Dilip.
Roger, thank you so much for taking us into a deep dive session on the Mirai Botnet, and also for providing us best practice advice on what our customers can do, how Akamai can help. There is a feedback survey after this slide. Again, I request everyone attending this webinar to fill out the survey. In terms of how Akamai can help and our security services portfolio, very quickly, our Kona security portfolio can protect your web applications, everything which is port 80 or 443. Prolexic can protect your entire data center infrastructure. That covers all ports and protocols. You can use our fast DNS service to protect your DNS infrastructure. And finally, our managed security service is available 24/7 by 365 to help you with any attacks. So we will get into Q&A in a moment. You should be able to click on the feedback survey at this point and provide your feedback. So Roger, the first question is, how does the Akamai Prolexic service defend against a Mirai attack, since the source IP is the ISP recursive DNS resolver, and hence rate limiting is no more effective?
Right, very good. So the bulk of Mirai attack can be handled quite easily by the Prolexic routed solution. When it gets specifically to your question, the DNS type of attack, where it's valid requests coming from valid IP, so you can't block at that level, there are two things that we can do. The first one is connection rate limiting. We can know that if a certain request is coming at a certain rate, that it's malicious. So rate of request is something that we can key on and knock down a large portion of the attack. The second component is actually signature writing. Signature writing is not highly scalable because the attacker can work around that pretty quickly, but it is highly effective in the short term. We generally try to put profiles in place that are more scalable, like a connection rate limiting. So while the PLX solution can knock down the majority of Mirai types of attacks, with a DNS attack, there's definitely going to be a certain amount of bleed of attack traffic. So maybe we can knock down with that particular solution 99% of the attack. 1% is still going to reach the customer. That 1% can still be overwhelming for many customers, not all, but for many customers. So it's still damaging. And that's where we have to work together to find what is the right degree of rate limiting or connection limiting, that we can put in place to protect the customer. The real answer is you need something like a fast DNS to be put in place in front. And while I'm already talking about that, you need multiple layers of DNS protection, right? So it has to be primary, secondary, very scalable. As everyone knows, without getting overly specific, there was a large DNS provider that was knocked offline. And if their customers had their secondaries set up to go either to another provider or to their own DNS infrastructure, they would have survived that type of outage. So DNS is one of the more challenging environments where you probably need a couple solutions in line.
Okay, thank you very much, Roger. A lot of people are asking us if they can get the deck that you shared, and there is a resources tab that should be available to the audience. You can click there and you should be able to download a PDF version of the presentation. Moving on to the next question, can Akamai detect the attacker's true client IP address behind a proxy? Because attackers can spoof IP address and make it look like it's coming from any geolocation.
Correct. So what it does is it changes your mitigation capability. So the fact that the problem with the Mirai is that it's a valid endpoint. So a lot of attacks are what we call a spoofed attack. So a huge attack comes in, we scan against that attack, and maybe this is where the questioner was going. We'll know that it's spoofed, and we'll just be able to stop it because that particular session or IP, suggested IP, doesn't actually answer properly. So we know it's malicious and can knock that attack down. What's the next stage from a difficulty perspective is if that IP is valid, and in this situation, Mirai is, in mass, a valid IP. Those are valid cameras out there. The problem is that, no, those IPs are changing all the time at approximately 20% a day. So you can't have a database, for example, that says, oh, here's all the Mirai actors out there, and have it be highly valid. The second piece is exactly as the questioner put, is what if those are behind a proxy? Yet that's yet another reason that you can't block this particular attack at the IP level, because then you would be doing damage to everyone else who happens to be sharing that IP range, which is why you need very specific other types of mitigation capabilities like connection rate limiting, which details down to, oh, it's just UDP. Is just UDP going to be coming out of that proxy? Probably not. Some of it, but not all of it, right? So you have to be very educated. The guys in the SOC and gals in the SOC here fight many, many attacks every day, so we're exposed to it constantly. So that's what we lean on to know what is the best way to mitigate this particular attack and the challenges associated with it.
Thank you, Roger. The next question, several of the Mirai attack vectors have the ability to spoof the source IP address. Is there any evidence that the botnet operators have explored which or how many of the bots are not behind anti-spoofing policies?
No, I haven't seen any of that come forward so far. And that's a great question, by the way, and that would be highly applicable to many different types of attacks, especially the more simplistic ones that have been out for a while. Mirai is so powerful that they don't care. There are so many millions upon millions of IoT devices out there, they just don't care if one gets identified and put into a database somewhere, because its IP is eventually going to roll or change. So while that's an excellent tactic to protect the attacker tool, with Mirai it's of low value because of the size. It's just it's a pinprick against them to attempt that type of action. The attacker wants to do what is the most efficient, and if they say, well, hey, I'm going to lose 5% of my capability by not doing this, they're not going to care.
Okay, thank you. The next question is related to our bot management product. And the question is the Mirai bot categorized as its own bot category with our bot management product? I think the answer is no, but Roger, I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yep, the answer is no. So to go specifically to Bot Manager, as the name describes, it's for managing bots. While it has that capability, it's not specifically for mitigating bots, right? There are other tools that we've been talking about that comes to mitigating attacks, which happen to be tied to bots. Bot Manager is extremely powerful and helps the customer manage what bots they want to see, what bots they don't want to see, what bots they want to slow roll, what bots they want to serve alternate pricing or alternate content to. So it's a way to manage overall what kind of bots are reaching out to them. There is no category for Mirai specifically in there because that's not in the core of what Bot Manager does. It just happens to also have some light mitigation capabilities. But if a customer has Bot Manager and Kona, for example, and routed, and they come into my SOC, we're typically going to use either the Kona product or the routed product to mitigate that, and not the Bot Manager component.
Thank you, Roger. The next question is somewhat unrelated. I will take that one. It has to do with the ability to use Akamai as a secondary authoritative DNS service, and if that is possible while maintaining control over the DNS records themselves. The answer to that is yes. You can use Akamai as a primary or a secondary authoritative service, and in either case, we will be front-ending the DNS requests coming from the end users. The next question has to do with rate limiting, and the question is, it's kind of general, Roger, and the question is, would it be wise, or do you recommend to have a connection rate limiting in place for our customers?
So there are a lot of different ways and themes tied to rate limiting. There are generic thresholds that say, I want to implement a rate limit from a single source IP perspective. That's what Kona, by the way, is extremely good at. And the answer is yes. You should know that, hey, my website on average sees 15 connections per second from an average user. If you ever see 50 connections, I am pretty sure that's a bad actor. Let's just cut them off. So the answer is yes in that scenario. If we talk about it from a more generic routing perspective from a rate limiter, my answer is no. I typically don't like rate limiting on its own because most rate limiters are not intelligent. So what that means is that, I'm going to put an upper threshold of 100 meg, and anything above 100 meg I'm going to rate limit and not allow through. That's eating good traffic. Is it a good idea on the surface because it keeps your firewall infrastructure alive and maybe doesn't knock it over also? Yes. Is it a bad thing because it's going to eat your good traffic? Yeah, absolutely. So I generally don't like it. It doesn't have a great amount of finesse for rate limiting. What I prefer is connection limiting. That's more intelligent. And what I was referencing when we were talking about the Mirai attack, connection limiting is very smart, similar to thresholds that I talked about a moment ago with Kona. And that's the challenge, right? There's so many different ways to attack and so many different ways to defend. You just have to have a lot of experience with it to know which is the best methodology. Thanks,
Roger. The next question, and I'm getting this from a couple of different people, has to do with between the different services that Akamai offers, which ones can help? And there are questions about, can Kona help with this? Can Prolexic help with this? Can you touch a little bit upon which security services can help and Is it one or the other, or a combination?
Yep, and the answer is it's up to the customer environment. So if the customer environment is totally web services based only, you just go with fast DNS and the Kona product. Those two things, generally we're saying, yes, there's some nuanced things around it like Site Shield to protect you from anybody going around a proxy and things like that. But in general, you're going to still need fast DNS for your DNS infrastructure. And then you're going to need the Kona not only for the rate limiting component, but at the individual IP level, but also the WAF component, so the prevention of SQL injection and the prevention of layer 7 types of attacks, right? So those two are all you'll need. If you say, I have additional services, I have VPN, I have mail, I have FTP, I have all of these other pieces, I have my own infrastructure house, so I need to protect that router in front that's sitting in front of your systems, then routed is the way to go because it's the solution for all ports and protocols.
Thanks, Roger. I think we are at our final question at this point, and this has to do with caching as a mitigation strategy. And the question is, and I'm assuming this is specific to the Kona product portfolio, how would Akamai be providing the cached pages, and for how long can those be served to end users until the SOC rectifies the issue in the event of an attack?
Okay, so the caching has, according to how you set it up in its provision, can have an unlimited amount of availability. The Kona, the Akamai Edge platform is absolutely huge. It's a quarter, it's 250,000 approximately endpoints in that. So it's so massive that it can just absorb all of the caching components. So caching availability is pretty close to a non-issue. What you want to be cautious of is what's not cached, what would possibly be passed through, and that's where you engage the professional services team to manage it on the front end for you. Now, what we do in the SOC is we have a couple of tools, and I'll talk quickly so we don't run out of time. We have several tools. So one of them is what we call a high visibility rule. That allows us to see the customer traffic coming into them that is not inclusive of current security rules or caching that's in play. That allows the SOC to identify anything that's malicious and write specific signatures. Now, when it's such a large infrastructure, it takes time to push that defensive measure out. So the SOC has the ability to see what are the top 100 endpoints that are the busiest for this particular customer. Let me push that rule initially to the top 100 endpoints. That knocks down approximately 80 to 90% of the attack immediately, while the rest of the infrastructure is receiving those defensive postures.
Okay, Roger, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for attending today's session. We hope you found it useful. And we will see you in a few weeks on our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.